Short is the story, long is the life.
Wukong's archive presents China Urban Legends, Jilin Beishan Ancient Graves. I first heard about the Beishan ancient graves in the autumn of 2014. That year, Jilin City was undergoing urban renovation. The city planned to build a road through the backside of Beishan, connecting Yuishan Road with Beijia Street to break a traffic bottleneck. The construction crew moved in at the end of August. Bulldozers rolled up to the back of the mountain. The project manager was a man named Zhang, 50-something years old, with 30 years of municipal engineering experience in Jilin. Old Zhang said that when he got the job, something felt off. Why? Because in the old-timers' talk, the Beishan area had always been restless. Before he started, he made some inquiries and was told that the back of Beishan had been a mass burial ground in the early days. But he never expected what happened with the very first scoop. It was a large Caterpillar D6 bulldozer. The driver was a young guy, barely 20, still green. His first scoop, the blade cut half a meter into the soil and pushed forward less than 10 meters, and then it stopped. Couldn't move. The kid gunned the engine. The bulldozer's tracks spun and smoked. The rear end lifted off the ground. It still wouldn't budge. He killed the engine and climbed down to look. Mixed in with the dirt the blade had turned up was something gray-white. A human skull. The blade had sliced the skull clean in half. One half was still embedded in the soil. The other lay rolling on the freshly turned earth. The young driver threw up on the spot. Old Zhang rushed over. He recognized it immediately. 30 years in the business, he'd seen this before. He ordered the crew to stop work and called the Cultural Relics Bureau.
Old Lu said they were in their weekly meeting when the call came. The call went straight to the director's office. The director's face changed the moment he knew what was on the back of Beishan.
That afternoon, Old Lu and two others from the bureau went to the site. He described the scene to me, autumn sunlight falling on the back of Beishan. The area the construction crew had excavated was about the size of 2 basketball courts. The ground was littered with bone fragments, rotten wood, broken tiles. In some spots, the soil was black, completely different from the yellow earth around it. That was soil soaked with the decomposition of human remains. In the black soil, traces of green patina could be seen here and there, evidence of burial goods, bronze coins or buttons that had rotted away over time. Old Lu crouched down and examined the bones. He had a proper archaeology background, graduated from Jilin University's archaeology department. Just from what was exposed on the surface, he counted at least 7 skeletons, 4 complete, 3 partial. Coffin planks were visible too, clearly old. He picked up one piece of wood and pinched it. It crumbled to powder.
At least 30 years for wood to rot to this degree, Old Lu said. These things are over 100 years old.
He looked at the surrounding terrain. The back of Beishan was a gentle slope, about 15 degrees. Rainwater runoff would carry soil from higher ground to lower ground, meaning some graves had probably been naturally eroded over time. Some of the surface bone fragments had been washed down from higher up. He filed a detailed report recommending a full work stoppage for emergency archaeological investigation. The higher-ups deliberated for 3 days. Every day of delay meant over 100,000 yuan in losses. But in the end, they approved it. Construction was halted for 3 full months. The archaeological team moved in on September 10th. Leading them was Professor Li Binghua from the Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology, 63 years old, a veteran of Jilin archaeology. He'd spent 40 years working in the field, participating in excavations at Longtan Mountain, Maorshan Cemetery, and Zichuanshan. Professor Li brought 6 graduate students and 3 technicians. Together with Old Lu's team from the Cultural Relics Bureau, they set up tents on the back of Beishan. The first 2 weeks were spent on surface survey. Professor Li had everyone form a line, 2 meters apart, walking from the foot of the back slope to the midpoint, then doing it again. Any anomaly on the ground, changes in soil color, unusual plant growth, distribution of surface pottery, was marked on the survey map. The results shocked everyone. Across roughly 20,000 square meters of the back slope, about 3 standard football fields, traces of at least 30 ancient graves were found. Some still showed the outlines of burial mounds, though after over 100 years of erosion they were nearly flush with the ground. But the soil was different, denser, darker than the natural earth. Some spots showed only depressions in the ground, where coffins had rotted away, the fill above them had settled, creating shallow pits. Professor Li marked out excavation units and began formal digging. The first trench was east-west, 30 meters long and 2 meters wide. Standard archaeological procedure: dig a trench first to establish the stratigraphy and cultural deposits, then decide the next step. At 60 centimeters deep, the cultural layer appeared. The soil showed clear signs of charcoal and burnt earth, evidence of human activity. At about 1 meter deep, the first grave appeared. It was a pit grave, oriented east-west, about 1 meter 80 long and 60 centimeters wide. There was no trace of a coffin inside, probably the body had been wrapped in straw mats, which had completely decomposed. The skeleton was poorly preserved, acidic soil had corroded the bones heavily, only fragments of leg bones and skull remained.
Professor Li dated the grave to the Daoguang reign of the Qing Dynasty based on its structure and a few copper coins found inside Daoguang Tongbao.
And right next to this grave, less than half a meter away, a second grave appeared. Same structure, same depth, but oriented north-south. The 2 graves were almost overlapping at an angle. Professor Li frowned. According to traditional Chinese burial customs, after an ancestor was interred, people wouldn't bury someone else right next to them, unless this was communal burial ground, first come first served. But this wasn't what truly unsettled Professor Li. It was the 3rd row of graves. As they cleaned the fill from the 3rd row, something unexpected happened. It was late September, and Jilin's autumn was already turning cold. A graduate student was cleaning the east wall of a brick-chambered grave with a small trowel. At a certain depth, his trowel hit something and made a sharp metallic clang. Everyone stopped. Old Lu walked over and crouched down. He dug through the soil with his hands and pulled something out. A dagger. The dagger was completely rusted. The blade edge had corroded into a serrated shape. The blade and handle had rusted together, almost indistinguishable. But traces of leather remained on the handle, probably the grip wrapping, completely carbonized, crumbling at a touch. The blade was about 20 centimeters long, a common hunting knife pattern. Old Lu turned the dagger over in his hands. The rust wasn't uniform, some spots were heavily rusted, others less so. This meant the blade had been corroded by different substances, blood and soil corrode differently.
This is a murder weapon, Professor Li said after a single glance. Old Lu later wrote in this dagger is severely rusted. The blade shows signs of rolled edges and nicks. The possibility that it was used as a weapon before being interred as a burial object cannot be ruled out.
But Old Lu knew in his heart. Was this dagger connected to the brick-chambered grave? Whose was it? Did it belong to the person buried alive there, or to those who buried him? Nobody knows.
The 3rd row of graves was at the east end of the trench, about 1.5 meters below the surface. This was a brick-chambered grave, far more elaborate than the others. The chamber was built with blue bricks bonded with lime mortar. The top was covered with 2 large granite slabs. Inside, the chamber measured about 2 meters long, 1.5 meters wide, and 1.2 meters high. Professor Li judged this to be at least a person of rank, or a wealthy household, from the Guangxu reign. Standard archaeological procedure: first clear the exterior, open the roof, then clear the interior. The graduate students spent 2 days clearing all the fill above the chamber, exposing the 2 granite slabs. Then they hit a problem: the slabs were too heavy to move by hand. They needed a small crane. But before the crane arrived that day, Professor Li decided to take a look first. He stood at the mouth of the grave and peered through the gap between the slabs. The widest gap was about 3 or 4 centimeters. Through it, he could see the interior of the chamber. Professor Li looked for about 10 seconds. Then he turned around, his face ashen.
He said one thing: fill it back. We're not digging this one.
Everyone was stunned. The graduate students looked at each other in confusion. Old Lu was frozen too. This was Professor Li, the most experienced archaeologist in Jilin, the man who had overseen dozens of excavations, who had never abandoned a dig halfway. Old Lu walked over and quietly asked what was wrong.
Professor Li was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Come here and look. But don't go down."
Old Lu crouched at the mouth of the grave and peered through the gap. What he saw inside was completely different from what he'd expected. There was no coffin below. At least, no intact coffin. On the floor of the chamber lay a layer of gray-brown sediment, the decomposed remains of wood and organic matter mixed together. And in the center of that sediment, a clear, human-shaped impression, pressed deep into the earthen floor. It was a curled-up human silhouette. The head impression was deepest, the skull, heaviest, had pressed deepest into the earth. The body was slightly shallower. The arms were folded across the chest, the legs bent, knees almost touching the chest. The entire outline held a posture of extreme contraction.
Around the human-shaped impression was a ring of dark brown stain, the mark of liquid seeping into the soil. Not coffin fluid. Human tissue fluid. Professor Li later told Old Lu privately that it was the sweat of the corpse.
"He was buried alive," Professor Li said. His voice was low, but certain.
How could he be sure? Because if it had been a corpse, already stiff, placed into the chamber, the posture wouldn't change. As a complete body decomposed, the bones would loosen, the skull would roll to one side. But this posture was different. It was the position of a person who was still alive, whose body still had elasticity, curling up in a fetal position. If someone is thrown into a tomb alive, they struggle, they curl up, they try to protect themselves. That curled posture is completely different from the straight-leg burial of the dead. Professor Li had spent his life in archaeology. He had seen every kind of burial: supine straight leg, side curled, prone, secondary burial, cremation, everything. But a live burial, he had only read about in literature. This was the first time in his career that he had seen it with his own eyes.
That night, Professor Li called Old Lu outside the tent and smoked for a long time. Finally he said, "That chamber has a person trapped in it. Has been trapped in there for over 200 years.
The brick-chambered grave was backfilled. Professor Li ordered everyone present never to speak of it to outsiders. The students agreed. Old Lu agreed. But Old Lu could never let it go. He spent the next 3 months in the Jilin City archives and the old book stacks of the Jilin City Library, searching for information. He wanted to understand, how had all those graves come to be on the back of Beishan? And who was that person? He found some crucial pieces.
The Jilin City local gazetteer records that in the late Qing Dynasty, multiple large-scale plagues swept through the northeast. In 1862, the first year of the Tongji reign, cholera ravaged Jilin. The local gazetteer states, the epidemic raged. Entire households were infected. Medicine was useless. the dead lay piled upon each other. Another document from the same year records, all coffins were exhausted. Thus the dead were wrapped in reed mats and buried at the back foot of Beishan.
But that was only one outbreak.
In 1888, the 14th year of the Guangxu reign, disease struck Jilin again. The Jilin Comprehensive Gazetteer records, at the junction of summer and autumn, epidemic disease spread. Both city and countryside were infected. The dead could not be counted. In 1902, the 28th year of the Guangxu reign, another outbreak. A great plague swept through. Of those infected, not 1 in 100 survived. Jilin City lost dozens per day. And in 1910 to 1911, the Great Manchurian Plague that Dr. Wu Lingtai fought in Harbin spread to Jilin City. Archives record, more than 300 infected in Jilin Prefecture. Over half died.
Every time an epidemic came, a new batch of graves appeared on the back of Beishan. But old Lu discovered that the back of Beishan held more than just plague victims. There was another category of people.
He found in Qing administrative document from 1889, the 15th year of the Guangxu reign. It recorded an incident, that winter, a riot broke out in Jilin City. Several veterans of the Sino-Japanese War gathered to cause trouble and were suppressed by the authorities. 3 main offenders were sentenced to decapitation, carried out at the execution grounds west of the city. After the execution, no one claimed the bodies. The authorities followed standard procedure, abandoned corpses, buried at the back foot of Beishan. Another document from 1912, the first year of the Republic, a great fire in Jilin City destroyed over 200 houses and burned more than 30 people to death. The unclaimed bodies were also buried at the back foot of Beishan. Natural disasters, epidemics, freezing to death, execution by beheading, unclaimed bodies, all of them ended up on the back of Beishan. That place, for nearly 200 years from the Qing Dynasty to the Republic, was Jilin City's final repository.
Old Lu did the math. From the late Qianlong reign to the early Republic, about 130 years. Based on the epidemics and disasters recorded in the local gazetteer, the back of Beishan held at least 3,000 to 5,000 bodies. And that didn't include those buried there by their own families.
3,000 lives. No tombstones. No names. No descendants to burn incense. Just lying quietly beneath the soil on the back of Beishan.
Old Lu said there was a caretaker at Beishan named Old Zhou who had worked there for 15 years and knew the mountain better than anyone. Zhou told him something he'd never mentioned to anyone else. He said the back slope of Beishan had always been known among the management staff to be restless. Around the Qingming festival every year, the weeds on the back slope grew especially fast, much taller than the same species on the front of the mountain. The maintenance crew complained more than once that the grass on the back slope was like crazy and grew back as soon as you cut it. At first Joe dismissed it, maybe the back slope had less sunlight and more moisture, so plants grew faster. But then he noticed something, the spots where the grass grew fastest matched exactly with the locations of the graves the archaeological team had found. Where there were graves, the grass was thickest and tallest. Where there were no graves, the grass was normal. The fertility down there is different, Joe said. You couldn't fertilize that well if you tried. By fertility, he meant the organic matter of human decomposition seeping into the soil. Old Lu said nothing. He couldn't find words.
Old Lu said there was another angle to the back of Beishan, a Fengshui angle. Beishan in Jilin is a very interesting mountain from a Fengshui perspective. It sits northwest of the city. In the 8 trigrams, the northwest corresponds to the Qian position. Qian represents heaven, the Yang position. That's why people built the Guandi Temple, the Medicine King Temple, and the Jade Emperor Pavilion there, all Yang religious structures to guard the mountain's Yang energy. The temples on the mountain, with their thriving incense, generated more and more Yang energy, making the entire mountain more righteous.
But the other side, the back, was different.
Traditional Chinese feng shui emphasizes embracing yin and holding yang, with mountains at the back and water in front. The south-facing slope of a mountain receives sunlight, that's the yang side. The north-facing slope is shaded, that's the yin side. Beishan faces south, the south side faces Jilin City and gets the sun, while the north side is perpetually shaded. According to Fengshui, the yang side belongs to the living. The yin side belongs to the dead. The front of Beishan was filled with temples and incense, whose religious structures had built the yang energy on the front into a barrier over centuries. The yin energy on the north side, what the living needed nothing to do with, was blocked behind the mountain. The mountain stood like a wall, separating yang from yin. So when plagues came, people died, and the authorities needed to dispose of bodies. The back of Beishan became the most natural choice. That place was already yin. Yin added to yin became extreme yin. Old Lu said this feng shui explanation aligned with what he found in the archives. The first person buried on the back of Beishan was a convicted criminal from the Qianlong reign. He was executed by decapitation, his body unclaimed. The authorities sent someone to bury him at the back of Beishan. That was the earliest one. From then on, more and more bodies, the victims of natural and human disasters, were buried there.
By the early Republic, if anyone in Jilin City needed to dispose of an unclaimed body, the first place that came to mind was the back of Beishan. That place had developed a fixed social function, a place to bury unwanted people.
And every person buried there had died unnaturally. Decapitated, plague, burned, frozen, buried alive. Not a single one had died of old age in their bed. In folk belief and feng shui, the souls of those who die unnaturally are called Guangxu, wrongful death, and carry the heaviest resentment. That resentment was blocked by the yang energy of Beishan's front, unable to disperse, accumulating thicker and thicker. Old Lu said he didn't know whether feng shui had any scientific basis. But one thing was certain: those people who died unnatural deaths were buried without any funeral rites. No prayers, no ghost money. No one wept for them. And according to traditional Chinese funeral culture, if a person dies without descendants to wail for them, without ghost money to guide their way, without a Taoist or Buddhist priest to conduct the ceremony, their soul cannot leave. They remain trapped where they died.
So those thousands of people on the back of Beishan, all of them were trapped there. But what truly unsettled Old Lu wasn't the historical records. It was something he experienced himself. February 2016, just after the Spring Festival. Jilin's winter hadn't passed. White mist rose from the Songhua River. The temperature was minus 25 degrees Celsius. Jilin winters are brutally cold, but Old Lu was used to it.
He got a call from old Joe at the Beishan management office. Joe's voice was strange on the phone, hesitant, halting. "Brother Lu, you need to come over. There's something I can't explain. You need to see it yourself."
Old Lu went to the Beishan office. Joe grabbed 2 military-style winter coats and led him toward the back of the mountain. The snow was deep, up to mid-calf. The two of them trudged single file through the snow for about 20 minutes, reaching the site where the archaeological team had excavated. What Joe pointed at made Lu freeze. The snow had melted. Not a small patch. A circular area about 3 meters in diameter, centered exactly on the backfilled brick-chambered grave. The snow was completely gone, revealing bare earth beneath. It was March in Jilin. The ground temperature was still below freezing. The surrounding snow was half a meter deep. But inside that circle, there wasn't a trace of snow. The soil surface was moist, darker in color than the surrounding earth. Looking closely, there were fine radial cracks spreading from the center outward, as if something underground had expanded and pushed the surface open. Old Lu crouched down and held his hand over the soil. It was distinctly warm. Not hot but warm, maybe about 10 degrees Celsius. The air around was minus 25. The contrast was stark.
"How long?" Old Lu asked. "I've been watching it for 5 days," Joe said. Joe had worked at Beishan management for over a decade and knew every inch of the mountain. He said he'd spotted it 5 days ago on his patrol. The first day, he thought someone had burned something there. But when he got closer, there were no ashes, no traces of fire. He came back the next day. The ground was still bare. Snow fell on it and melted instantly. Couldn't stay.
5 consecutive days. Temperatures at -20-something every day. And the snow just wouldn't stay on that patch of ground. Old Lou stood up and walked around the area, observing. He noticed something: the bare patch wasn't perfectly circular. It was slightly elongated toward the southeast, a somewhat irregular ellipse. The long axis was about 3.2 meters, the short axis about 2.5 meters. A thought struck him: this shape almost perfectly matched the outline of the brick-chambered grave below. He didn't dare think about it further. He took several photos and a video with his phone. Back at the bureau, he reported the situation to his superiors.
Their response was measured. They said the Beishan area had too many civilian graves historically, and decomposing organic matter underground would generate some heat, methane fermentation, microbial decomposition, chemical reactions, raising the ground temperature and causing snow to melt. This was a normal natural phenomenon. Don't make a fuss. That area had already been backfilled. Don't touch it again.
At the time, Old Lou thought they had a point. Organic decomposition does generate heat. The coffin, the body, the burial textiles inside a sealed brick chamber, all slowly decomposing in an enclosed space with no ventilation. The heat would accumulate and dissipate slowly. It could indeed cause a local ground temperature anomaly. But one question occurred to him later, too late to ask: that brick-chambered grave was 1.5 meters below the surface. Above it was 1.5 meters of fill. On top of that was a layer of frozen ground. At -25 degrees, the frost would penetrate at least 0.5 meter deep. 1.5 meters of soil plus 0.5 meter of frozen ground, 2 meters of insulation total. Even if there was heat generation below, could it penetrate 2 meters of earth? Could it penetrate the frozen layer?
Old Lou wanted to ask a geologist or a geothermal expert.
But after asking around, he found that the people in Jilin who could answer that question either didn't want to talk or gave vague, evasive answers. The next winter, January 2017. Old Lou went back to the back of Beishan. This time he went alone. He stood at a distance and looked through binoculars. The patch of ground was under snow. The snow hadn't melted. He breathed a sigh of relief. But the third year, 2018, he went again. That patch had melted again. And this time, the area was larger than the year before. He brought an infrared thermometer this time. From a distance, he measured the bare soil surface at 6.2 degrees Celsius. The surrounding snow surface was -19.8. A difference of 26 degrees. He went back for 3 more winters after that. The results varied each year. In 2019 it melted. In 2020 it didn't. In 2021 it melted, and the area had doubled, from 3 or 4 meters in diameter to 5 or 6. In 2022 it didn't melt again. Like some kind of cycle, once every 2 years, each time more intense than the last.
Old Lou said he later researched extensively, trying to find a scientific explanation for the phenomenon. He checked Jilin's geothermal distribution data. Beishan wasn't on any geothermal zone. Jilin's geothermal resources were concentrated in the Fengman district, along the Guandi River, kilometers away. He checked Beishan's geological data. The mountain strata were Cretaceous sandstone and mudstone, with a granite basement below. No abnormal geological activity.
He even privately asked a friend who taught geology at Northeast Electric Power University. After listening to Old Lou's description, The friend was silent for a long time. Finally he said, "That brick chamber of yours, what if all the organic matter inside has completely decomposed? Over 200 years, every bit of organic material would be gone. After it's all decomposed, where does the heat come from?"
The geology professor, let's call him Chun, met old Lu for a face-to-face talk. They met by the Songhua River on South Mountain. The weather was cold, steam rising from the river surface. The two men stood by the riverbank, each holding a cup of hot soy milk.
Professor Chen was an associate professor of engineering geology who had lived in Jilin for over 30 years and knew the city's geology inside out. Old Lu told Chen everything: the infrared thermometer data, the yearly changes in the melted snow area, the depth and structure of the brick chamber. Chen listened intently. After a full minute of silence, he spoke. "First, let me rule out the two most obvious possibilities. 1. Geothermal Beishan is not on any geothermal anomaly zone. The nearest geothermal indicator in Jilin is 8 kilometers upstream in the Fengman district, at Daoguang. 2. Methane or swamp gas. If it were fermentation-generated heat, the rate of production would be uniform and unpredictable. You're telling me that a specific spot in winter is 26 degrees warmer than its surroundings, the temperature difference and persistence cannot be explained by biological fermentation. So what can you explain?" Old Lu asked. "Nothing," Professor Chen said. "What I can tell you is this: within the current framework of engineering geology and geothermics, there is no existing model that can explain the phenomenon you've observed. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means we don't understand it yet." Chen thought for a moment and added, "You've worked in cultural relics your whole life. Have you ever considered one thing?" "What?"
If a person was buried alive, the fear, the rage, the despair they felt just before death, is that purely spiritual? Is it possible? I'm just asking, is it possible that under extreme emotional states, the human body produces something we don't yet understand?
Old Lu stared at the white mist on the river and said nothing.
Professor Chen continued, "One more thing. The snowmelt you observe happens in February and March. The coldest time in the northeast is January. So the coldest month doesn't produce the melting, but late February and March do? If this were geothermal heat, which is constant, you'd expect the most obvious effect during the coldest month, not the least. But what you're seeing is the opposite."
When Old Lu heard this, a chill ran down his spine.
Old Lu said there was one more detail he'd kept to himself.
After the archaeological team left in 2014, construction resumed. The road was eventually built. But the construction team changed the route. After a new survey, the planners moved the alignment 30 meters north, bypassing the densest concentration of ancient graves. But did the area they bypassed really have no problems?
Old Lu said it was hard to tell. 20,000 square meters on the back of Beishan, they'd actually excavated less than 2,000 square meters. 1/10. Nobody could say what was under the remaining ground.
After the road was built, every winter, those sections froze earlier and thawed later than other sections. The maintenance crews didn't know why. But Old Lu knew.
Old Lu said he found something in the archives that deeply disturbed him.
August 1945. After Japan surrendered, the Soviet Red Army entered Jilin City. The city spent over a year under Soviet control. Old Lu found some files from that period, recording unusual deaths.
March 1946, shortly before the Soviets withdrew, an incident occurred in Jilin. A local security regiment's internal document recorded 12 unidentified corpses found at the back foot of Beishan. Buried on site.
12 people, all buried at once. No record of who they were. No cause of death. No identification of who buried them. Just 12 people, buried on the back of Beishan.
Old Lu said he made a copy of that document and took it home. He calculated the people buried in 1946 had lain underground for 68 years by the time the archaeological team arrived in 2014. Those 12 were mixed in with the hundreds of other graves. Impossible to tell which were from the Qianlong reign and which were from after the war.
Time on the back of Beishan was flattened. People who died 100 years ago and people who died 60 years ago, they all became bones, became soil, became the same color. Old Lu later researched Jilin's history during that period. He found that from the winter of 1945 to the spring of 1946, Jilin City experienced a severe famine. After Japan's surrender, the puppet regime collapsed and a new government hadn't been fully established. The city's administration fell into a vacuum. The food supply was cut off. Some merchants who hoarded goods took the opportunity to jack up prices. A caddy of sorghum rice cost 5 yuan, a bag of flour cost over 100 yuan. Ordinary citizens couldn't afford food. Some starved to death in the streets. Those who starved were also buried on the back of Beishan.
Old Lu said as he read these records, one question kept circling in his mind. The person who was buried alive in that brick chamber, what did they have in common with the people who starved in 1946, or the criminals beheaded in the Guangxu reign?
The answer was simple. They were all people crushed by their era.
The great wheels of history roll forward, and something always gets left behind. The back of Beishan is Jilin City's scar of time.
In the autumn of 2023, Old Lu retired. On his last day at work, he packed up his office and loaded the boxes of professional books he'd accumulated over 20-plus years into his car. Before locking the door, he sat in his office for a while. On his desk was a large topographic map of Beishan, one he'd drawn himself during the 2014 archaeological survey. Every discovered and inferred grave location was marked on it. He stared at that map for a long time. He noticed something he'd never seen before. The graves weren't randomly distributed. They were roughly arranged in an arc along the contour lines of Beishan's back slope, like half a set of comb teeth. And at the center of that arc, precisely at the position of the brick-chambered grave. All the graves on the back of Beishan radiated outward from that live burial site. The earliest, the largest, the most elaborately constructed, at the center. The surrounding pit graves, straw mat graves, all of them had been buried around it over the decades.
In that moment, an idea struck Lu. Had the back of Beishan been identified as a place where you can bury people precisely because that first person had been buried there? The locals said that place has had burials, so the authorities sent unclaimed bodies there. Over time, a death-centered concentric circle formed around him.
One person, someone thrown alive into a pit, had drawn more than 3,000 people to his side over 200 years. Not a spiritual summons. Something more physical. Like gravity. A tiny black hole in a cemetery of forgotten souls.
That black hole, Old Lu said, might not be a metaphor. Maybe the mountain itself, the back of Beishan, was a vast, silent abyss, a black hole that devoured the forgotten. Old Lu said that after he retired, he often dreamed of that scene.
He dreamed he was standing on the back of Beishan, and the frozen ground split open. Countless hands reached out from the soil, not the skeletal hands of horror movies, more like fingerprints left on unfired clay, formless, the fingerprints of time itself. He wakes up every time from this dream.
This spring, Old Lu called me. He said he'd gone to Beishan again. Not in winter this time, late April. Spring comes late in the northeast. At the end of April, the snow on the mountain had just finished melting.
He didn't go directly to the back slope. First he visited the Guandi Temple, walking around the front of Beishan. There were 2 old pine trees at the temple entrance, over 200 years old, older than his grandfather's grandfather. He touched the bark. It was rough as sandpaper. Then he crossed over the ridge to the back slope. That patch of ground showed no anomaly this year. The snow was gone. The ground was dry. Grass shoots were pushing up. Everything looked normal. He crouched down and looked at the spot where the backfilled grave lay. The ground was covered in wild grass. Nothing seemed out of place. If he didn't know what was underneath, he would be no different from any other citizen out for a walk on Beishan. He stood up, ready to leave. Just as he turned, he heard something. At first he thought he was mishearing. He stopped and listened carefully. The wind whistled through the pine forest on Beishan, making a low moaning sound. But that wasn't what he heard. It was a very low, sustained sound, like something resonating deep underground. He didn't hear it with his ears so much as feel it through his feet, conducted through bone to his inner ear. He stood there for about 10 seconds. The sound lasted 10 seconds. That low resonant sound, he never heard it again. But he always felt it was still there, dozens of meters beneath the earth, just no longer reaching the surface. Then it disappeared.
Old Lu said his first reaction wasn't fear. It was a very complex emotion, something like grief.
He thought, those people buried down there, when they were interred, did they ever imagine that one day someone would know about them? Did that person curled up in the brick chamber ever imagine that?
Nobody should have to die like that, Old Lu said on the phone. And nobody should be forgotten like that. After he said this, the phone was silent for a long time. Then he said, I'll go back to Beishan again. I asked him what for. He said, some people need to be remembered. If no one goes there, then no one will really remember.
I remember after Old Lu finished telling me about Beishan, he asked me a question.
Have you heard similar stories in other cities? I thought for a moment and said, Beijing has the Northern Peak Empress Temple. Shanghai has the Zhujiahui Cathedral. Every ancient city has its hidden history. Some history is written in textbooks. Some is stored in archives. And some is written underground. Old Lu nodded. You're right. But I've spent half my life working with cultural relics, and I've come to feel more and more that a city's memory isn't really written on paper. Paper rots. Archives get lost. People forget. But the earth doesn't. Whatever is buried in the earth remembers. What's buried under Jilin City is 10 times more than what's written above ground. I asked him what he meant. He said, the back of Beishan is just the tip of the iceberg. Longtan Mountain, Dongchuanshan, Sichuanshan, there are ancient tombs all around Jilin. Sichuanshan culture is a 3,000-year-old Bronze Age site, older than the Zhou Dynasty in the Central Plains. People have been living in Jilin for 3,000 years. One generation buries the next, generation upon generation. Beneath this city lies a 3,000-year human history stacked in layers. The thousands on the back of Beishan are just the most recent layer.
I was silent for a long time after hearing this.
He said one more thing on the phone that I still remember vividly. He said, on Beishan, people go to those temples every day to burn incense and bow. They pray to Buddha for protection, pray to Lord Guan to appear, pray to the medicine king to cure their ills. But they don't realize, on the mountain they kneel on, the other side holds thousands of people who have never had a single person bow to them.
Sometimes I wonder if the people buried on the back of Beishan knew that hundreds of people are bowing every day right above them, but not a single one is bowing to them. What would they think? Would they be sad? Or would they no longer care?
I couldn't answer that question. Old Lu probably didn't expect me to. The stories buried beneath those roads are thicker than the traffic flowing above them.
We didn't talk any further after that. But I think about what Old Lu said every time I see a patch of ground where snow melts too early, or grass grows too thick, or a road surface cracks in a pattern no one can explain. I think about those thousands on the back of Beishan and about all the other backs of other mountains, in other cities, where other forgotten people lie.
There's an old Chinese saying, 人死如灯灭. When a person dies, it's like a candle being snuffed out. But the village elders have a different saying. They say a person dies twice. Once when the body stops breathing, and again when the last person who remembers them speaks their name for the final time. On the back of Beishan, thousands of candles were snuffed out across 2 centuries, and most of those names were spoken for the last time on the same day they were buried. Old Lu once told me that when he was a child, his grandmother took him to sweep the graves of ancestors he had never met. She would kneel before each mound, light 3 sticks of incense, burn a stack of ghost money, and whisper names he had never heard before. When he asked who those people were, his grandmother said, "These are our people. They walked the road before us. If we do not remember them, no one will."
That memory stayed with him. And maybe that is why he kept going back to the back of Beishan. Because there was no one else to go. The story is over. What do you think? Asterisk if you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. New urban legend every day, asterisk.